Elena Ramirez, a black prosecutor who took just 7 minutes to bring down a powerful judge in the courtroom. The tension was palpable, and the truth that had been buried for so long was finally exposed. Will she be able to overcome the unjust system that has been ruling for so long? The courtroom of the Western District Federal Court was bathed in a stark, almost blinding light, but it did nothing to dispel the suffocating tension that hung in the air, thick and oppressive like an incoming storm. Every step Elena Ramirez took seemed to echo, reverberating across the polished, cold tile floor. The sound of her heels striking the ground was sharp and rhythmic, like a countdown to the inevitable. Each step was calculated, deliberate. Her every movement was an act of defiance in a space where she had been made to feel small, invisible, and unwelcome. In her hands, Elena clutched a stack of files, a symbol of her tireless preparation, the culmination of countless hours spent poring over evidence, witness statements, and legal precedents. This was not just paperwork, it was the very lifeblood of her case. Each page was a weapon, meticulously sharpened to fight for justice in a system that had long been corrupted. She knew that this battle, if lost, could not only end her career but also silence the voices of the marginalized people she had sworn to protect. Failure was not an option. The heavy wooden door creaked open with a sound that sent a ripple through the room. The quiet was shattered, and with it, the fragile peace that had briefly hung in the air. Elena's heart raced in time with her footsteps, but she did not falter. As she crossed the threshold, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Their gazes were not filled with warmth, encouragement, or even curiosity. No, they were cold, dismissive, and most dangerously, filled with contempt. The eyes of the prosecutors fixed on her as though she were a mere nuisance to be dealt with, not a worthy adversary. The gallery was filled with silent disdain, hushed murmurs, sideways glances, faces that seemed to ooze indifference, and some that were outright scornful, as though she didn't belong in that space, as though a black woman, a young prosecutor, had no place challenging the system that had been in place for so long. Elena could almost hear the whispers, the unsaid judgments that filled the air. What does she think she's doing here? She'll never win. They're just going to chew her up and spit her out. Elena felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. Her chest tightened, but she didn't allow herself to falter. She had faced this before. The dismissive glances, the whispered insults, the doubts cast upon her mere existence in this space. This wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel like an outsider, but today was different. She could feel it in the air, in the way the room seemed to grow colder, in the way her heart pounded louder, faster. This wasn't just about a trial anymore. It was about survival. It was about confronting a system that was designed to keep people like her, people who look like her, down, a system that had long been ruled by people like Judge Harding, powerful, untouchable. And they all knew the same thing. No matter what happened in that courtroom, the scales of justice were not balanced. They were tilted, and tilted heavily, in favor of the ones who had always been in power. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing that broke the heavy silence as she moved further into the room. Elena didn't glance at the prosecutor's table. She didn't need to. She kept her eyes trained ahead, where the imposing figure of Judge Harding sat at the bench, his face cold, unreadable. He didn't look at her with the usual sense of formality. No, there was something else in his eyes, a quiet arrogance, a belief that she didn't belong there, that she was out of her depth. He looked at her as if she were a mere inconvenience, a blip in his otherwise perfect, carefully constructed world. And there he was, the man who had the power to ruin her, to destroy her with just one word: guilty. She stood there staring at him, her hands gripping the files so tightly her knuckles whitened. His eyes met hers, cold as steel, like an icy wind that could freeze you from the inside out. His gaze bore into her, calculating, dismissive, as if he had already made up his mind that she would fail. Elena knew this wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't even about the truth. It was about power, and right now, she had none. But Elena would not be cowed. She had spent too many years fighting for her place in this world, too many years proving her worth to people who wanted her to fail. She wasn't about to let this judge, this relic of an old, corrupt system, break her. Not today. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her, waiting for her to slip, to make a mistake. The pressure was suffocating, but she would not yield. Elena took a deep breath, inhaling the cool, stale air of the courtroom. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in on her chest, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. She stood tall, shoulders squared, her expression firm. She would not be intimidated. The whispers continued, the murmur of doubt, the voices that seemed to say, "She doesn't belong," grew louder in her mind, but she silenced. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Elena entered. Every eye in the room fixed upon her, but there was one gaze that stood apart from the rest. Judge Howard Harding's cold, unflinching stare. Meeting his eyes, Elena felt her heart tighten in her chest, as if his gaze alone could crush her will. He sat high on his bench, the very picture of authority, his eyes sharp as blades, devoid of emotion. No greeting, no nod of acknowledgement, only the chilling look of someone who considered her presence an intrusion, someone who believed she had no right to stand before him in this sacred space. The weight of that look felt like a slap to Elena's pride. She struggled to maintain her composure, to mask the unease that threatened to rise within her. But deep down, she could feel the small, fragile embers of her confidence beginning to flicker out. Judge Harding, the man whose power in this courtroom had earned him the fear and respect of all who entered, had already decided from the outset that she was unworthy of this space. His every glance, every movement, seemed to sneer at her, mocking her very existence here. As Elena placed the stack of files on the table, she could feel Harding's gaze never leaving her. He glanced at his wristwatch with apparent disinterest, then turned his cold eyes back to her, his lips curling into a slight, mocking smirk. "We won't waste too much time on this, will we, Miss Ramirez?" Judge Harding's voice was flat, unemotional, but the tone cut through the air like a sharp, jarring punch. His words weren't a question. They were a cold, condescending statement, an assumption that her efforts and her case were beneath him. Elena's throat tightened as if her voice had been stolen away. She tried to regain control, to push past the humiliation that threatened to overtake her, but each word from Harding felt like a knife, a wound to her dignity, a reminder of how small she seemed in the face of his power. She knew this man, knew the reputation he had built over the years, a reputation of ruling with an iron fist, of looking down upon those who didn't belong in his world. And now, Elena was one of those people. She had prepared for this moment, steeled herself against the inevitable disdain she would face, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold contempt emanating from Harding, the man who was supposed to be the very embodiment of justice. "You won't waste our time, will you?" Harding repeated, his voice now laced with even more scorn, a sharp reprimand masked as a question. It was clear he wanted her to understand that her very presence here was a disruption to the peace he had upheld for years. Elena felt the ice-cold sting of his words pierce through her, freezing everything around her. She wasn't just facing a biased judge. She was up against a system, one that had been carefully constructed to protect the powerful and disregard those who were beneath them. She had felt the sting of such condescension before, but today it felt different. Today, she wasn't just standing before Judge Harding, but before everything he represented, a system built to silence voices like hers. "You don't need to explain any further, Miss Ramirez," Harding continued, his words dismissive, as if he had already decided the outcome of this case. "I don't have time for these theatrics." The weight of his words pressed down on Elena's chest like an iron vice. She could feel the heat of her anger rising, the blood pounding in her veins, but she forced herself to remain composed. She clenched her hands, feeling the warmth in her palms, but she kept her composure, not allowing her emotions to escape. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the numbness threatening to take over her. This wasn't just about a trial. It was about something much bigger. She knew the system had already decided her fate, but she also knew that if she backed down now, nothing would ever change. This system would continue to crush the voices of the powerless, and Elena Ramirez would be the only one willing to stand against it. She refused to let Harding or anyone else here see her break. She had come too far, too hard, to let this moment be the one that defined her. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by this very system. Elena took one more deep breath, standing tall, knowing that this fight, this moment, was just the beginning. The courtroom felt suffocatingly still, as if the air had thickened with every passing moment. Elena opened her file with deliberate care, her fingers trembling slightly as she retrieved the copies of the illegal financial transactions Davies had executed. The rustling of paper seemed to echo far too loudly in the tense silence, each sound marking the beginning of a battle she knew would define everything. She placed the documents down with an almost reverent precision on the table, her eyes unwavering as they locked onto Judge Harding. But as the seconds dragged on, she couldn't help but notice how his gaze remained fixated on his wristwatch, each glance more pronounced than the last, a subtle yet unmistakable sign that he was dismissing her before she'd even begun. Elena's hand tightened around the evidence, the weight of it grounding her as she drew in a steadying breath. This was her moment. The proof of Davy's crimes was irrefutable, undeniable. The financial records displayed unmistakable signs of embezzlement, the numbers stark and glaring, like a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to the defendant's door. She knew this was the key to everything, the piece of the puzzle that could unravel the corruption within the system. Yet, as she prepared to present the evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how solid it was, she was about to be met with rejection, not for the lack of truth, but because she was the one presenting it. With measured poise, Elena began to speak, her voice steady but tinged with the undercurrent of urgency that threatened to break through. She chose each word carefully, as if they were weapons she was preparing to wield in this war of words. The courtroom seemed to hang on her every syllable, the air thick with anticipation. These transactions, she began, her voice cutting through the silence, took place in May and June of this year, when Charles Davies, the defendant, transferred over $5 million from a public fund into his personal account, using a shell company to hide the movement of these funds. These documents are not a mere formality. They are proof of deception, proof of corruption, and proof of a breach of public trust. As Elena spoke, she could almost feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. She glanced around the room, noting the audience's shift in focus. Every eye seemed to be on her, every ear straining to absorb the gravity of what she was revealing. For a brief, fleeting moment, it felt as though the room itself had paused, collectively holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But then, just as she expected, the silence shattered. Judge Harding, without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement, tilted his head slightly and let out a low, derisive chuckle. It wasn't a laugh of disbelief. It was the laugh of someone who had already decided the outcome long before the trial began. His eyes never left her as he shifted in his chair, making no effort to hide his disdain. So this is what we're doing now. Harding's voice rang out, colder than before, dripping with condescension. You want me to believe this? He gestured lazily at the papers on the table with a dismissive flick of his hand, his gaze never leaving her face. Are we really going to place our faith in these numbers, Miss Ramirez? Are you absolutely certain this isn't just some misunderstanding, a mere typo perhaps? Or is this simply the work of someone who's clearly overstepping her bounds in a courtroom far above her head? The words hit Elena like a series of slaps across her face, each one landing with brutal force. The sarcasm, the ridicule, every syllable felt like a personal attack. Her throat tightened, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to spin around her. But Elena fought it. She couldn't afford to let her composure crack. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. The mocking tone in Harding's voice seemed to reverberate through her chest, each syllable echoing the judgment he had already passed upon her, upon the case, upon everything she stood for. She had known this moment might come, the moment when her integrity and her professionalism would be called into question. But hearing it from him, the very person who was supposed to uphold justice, made it feel like a punch in the gut. She had prepared for this. She had prepared to face the disbelief, the mockery, the systemic bias that had so often marred her journey. But nothing could have prepared her for the utter disregard that dripped from Harding's words. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling mixture of superiority and contempt as he leaned forward, almost challenging her, as if daring her to prove him wrong. This, Miss Ramirez, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, is a sideshow, a display of someone who doesn't yet understand the weight of the courtroom. And quite frankly, he continued, his tone ice cold, I don't have time for such theatrics. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on her, and for a fleeting moment, Elena felt the all-too-familiar sting of humiliation. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to push through it, but the contempt in Harding's voice lingered, suffocating her, threatening to drown out her words. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she fought to steady it. She wasn't here to succumb to ridicule. She was here to see justice done. And yet, the weight of the courtroom seemed unbearable. Elena knew deep down that this wasn't just about her. It was about everything that had been done to silence people like her, people who had been ignored, trampled upon, and cast aside. She wasn't just fighting for this case. She was fighting for her place in the system, fighting for every person whose voice had been muted by those who held power. But Judge Harding wasn't finished. "Take these away, Miss Ramirez," Harding ordered coldly, his voice dismissive. And then, with a casual glance, he turned to Davy's defense attorney, signaling for them to proceed. It was as if he had already decided the outcome of the trial, as if Elena and her evidence were nothing more than an inconvenience to him. The courtroom erupted into a subtle murmur, quiet laughter from the back, an uncomfortable rustle from the gallery, but no one dared to voice any objections. Elena's heart sank as the weight of her failure pressed down on her like an anvil. For a moment, it felt as if everything had collapsed around her. The evidence she had fought so hard to gather, the hours spent poring over details, the truth that had been painstakingly uncovered. It all felt so insignificant in the face of Harding's dismissal. But Elena didn't flinch. She didn't give in to the sting of humiliation. She was here to fight, and she would not let herself be silenced by the likes of Harding. With a calmness she didn't fully feel, she took a deep breath, forcing the burn of anger and frustration down into the pit of her stomach. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cool and steady, "I can present further evidence if necessary." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. No matter how much they mocked her, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, she wouldn't let the truth be buried. Not today. The numbers in her hands weren't going anywhere. The truth wouldn't be erased, no matter how hard Harding or anyone else tried to dismiss it. And Elena Ramirez would see to it that it would be heard. The weight of isolation, humiliation, and powerlessness began to rise within Elena like a tidal wave, drowning everything she had once held dear. After being mocked by Judge Harding, Elena took a step back, struggling to steady her breath. But the air in the courtroom had shifted. A heavy, almost suffocating presence enveloped her, and from somewhere in the room, a faint whisper reached her ears, sharp and cutting through the tension like a dagger to her heart. "She doesn't belong here." The words were not spoken aloud, but they rang so clearly in Elena's mind, reverberating in the space between her ears. She turned around, searching for the source of this cruel whisper, but all she could see were cold, indifferent gazes. No one dared to meet her eyes. The words felt like a mark, a reminder from a world she knew all too well, a world that had always considered her an outsider, a woman not worthy of standing in the spaces where those with power, like Judge Harding and the elite lawyers, ruled. Elena felt the blood in her veins slow, the heat of anger and the cold of loneliness invading every corner of her body. She didn't want to look at Judge Harding, because she knew his eyes would be no different from all the others in the room. They didn't contain fairness or respect, only disdain, only rejection. Her steps felt heavier, not because she lacked strength, but because she began to feel that every move she made in this room was a battle not just for justice, but for her very existence within this system, a system that wasn't built for people like her. Black women prosecutors without the privilege or connections that protected others. "She doesn't belong here." The whisper repeated over and over in her mind, like a blade cutting deep into old wounds. Wounds she thought were buried but never fully healed. This wasn't the first time Elena had faced racism, but each time it hit her heart like a new wound. This time, the racism wasn't just a glance or an offensive remark from someone on the outside. It came from the very place she had hoped would protect justice. A courtroom, a place where lies and corruption were supposed to be exposed. But no, this was a place where fairness had been distorted, where she was nothing more than an illegal intruder in a space that was meant to belong to the deserving. Elena stood there, a hollow feeling in her chest, yet her heart burned with fury. She could hear the sighs from the people around her, as if they all knew the injustice she was enduring. Some faces twisted into smirks, while others focused on their computers, pretending not to notice her at all. Only a few unfamiliar faces in the public gallery looked at her with sympathy, but they were just observers, powerless to change the system that had been in place for far too long. Elena couldn't allow herself to collapse, not here, not now. She had to press on, had to fight not just for this case, but for everything it represented. She couldn't let herself become a victim of a system that those in power had built to protect themselves. They could sneer at her, they could mock her, but the truth she carried couldn't be forgotten. When Elena looked back down at the file, trying not to let the feeling of being cast aside overwhelm her once again, she could feel every eye in the room focused on her. She knew that one slip of the tongue, one moment of weakness, and she would be buried under the weight of this space, lost in the shadows of the prejudice that she would never be able to overcome. She stood tall, But the chill that spread through the room was undeniable, the coldness of indifference, of those who had long since lost the ability to empathize. With every passing second, Elena felt that she was not just fighting for justice, but fighting for the right to exist in a world full of barriers she was never supposed to cross. She wanted to scream, to let everyone know that she wasn't an outsider, that she had every right to stand here, but deep down she knew that no one would listen. The harsh, unforgiving lights above seemed to shine down upon Elena, casting long shadows across the room, turning the atmosphere in the courtroom colder than it had been before. All the attention in the room shifted to her, and Elena could feel the weight of every single gaze. She had prepared for this moment for what felt like an eternity, and now, with each step she took towards the podium, the tension within her began to build like a storm about to break. Every glance from the public gallery, from the lawyers, and from Judge Harding felt like sharp blades pointed directly at her. She didn't dare look back, but the sensation of being watched gnawed at her, as if every pair of eyes was silently judging her every movement. Her hands tightened into fists, betraying the nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. Despite her best efforts to remain composed, the pressure was becoming overwhelming. Standing before the podium, Elena took a deep breath. She had meticulously prepared the material she had brought with her: accounting ledgers, invoices, and copies of the illegal bank transactions Davies had executed. The numbers on these documents were irrefutable, clear, and precise, making them impossible to dispute. With calm precision, Elena reached into her file and pulled out the first set of documents. She raised them slowly, deliberately, ensuring that every single person in the room had no choice but to focus on her. As the papers rose, Elena's gaze hardened into one of steely resolve, her eyes reflecting a deep determination. She wasn't just showing evidence. She was revealing the truth. And in that moment, she wasn't just waiting for a response. She was anticipating the revelation of something much bigger. "Your Honor," she began, her voice unwavering, no longer shaky like it had been moments before, "we have conducted an independent investigation and have uncovered undeniable evidence of embezzlement by Mr. Charles Davies. These transactions are not just a simple technical error. They are part of a systematic scheme of deceit." With these words, Elena began to outline the financial figures, her finger pointing to the projections on the screen as the crowd followed each detail closely. Each transaction appeared clearly. Each dollar Davies had funneled into his own personal accounts through shell companies. These were not small amounts, and collectively, they totaled millions of dollars. "Do you even know who you're up against, Miss Ramirez?" Harding continued, leaning forward with an almost predatory grin. "Davies is untouchable. He's been at this for years, and you're a rookie, just another naive newcomer trying to make a name for yourself in a game you clearly don't understand." His words weren't just dismissive. They were venomous, dripping with an arrogance that made Elena's blood boil. "What you have here," he said, waving a hand dismissively at the evidence, "is nothing more than a bunch of numbers on a page, a few lines that you think can unravel everything. But they won't. They won't even come close." The sting of his words hit Elena hard, and for a brief moment, she could feel the weight of his disdain pressing down on her chest. She had known this battle wouldn't be easy, but to hear it from him, someone who had spent decades entrenched in a corrupt system, was a bitter pill to swallow. The room seemed to blur around her as the rage built up inside her, but she refused to let it show. She could feel the eyes on her, watching, waiting to see if she would crack. And in that moment, Elena realized something crucial. Harding wasn't just attacking her. He was attacking everything she stood for, everything she believed in. His mocking laugh echoed in her ears as he leaned back in his chair, a look of smug satisfaction spreading across his face. "You're out of your depth, Miss Ramirez," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't have what it takes to defeat someone like Davies. You're just a small part in a much bigger game." The words were a blow, but Elena didn't flinch. Her pulse raced, but she knew she couldn't let him see her weaken. She had come too far to let him or anyone else diminish the truth she was carrying. For a split second, Elena felt as though the world had come crashing down on her. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, suddenly seemed like it was teetering on the edge of collapse. But then, in the very next moment, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let him make her doubt herself. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. She took a deep breath, her shoulders squared, and locked eyes with Judge Harding. The fire in her gaze burned with a new intensity. She wasn't just standing here to fight for Davies' conviction. She was standing here to fight for something much bigger, for herself, for the truth, and for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or belittled by people like him. "Thank you for reminding me of my place, Your Honor," Elena said, her voice steady but carrying a quiet fury. She wasn't backing down. "But you're wrong. I don't need to be one of the old hands to understand that justice has to be served. I don't need to be like you to know that the truth must be upheld, no matter how many powerful people try to hide it." Her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. She wasn't trying to convince him. She was speaking the truth, and that truth didn't need his approval. Elena's eyes didn't leave his, unwavering. The weight of the room shifted with her words, and for the first time, she could see a flicker of something behind Harding's steely expression. It wasn't respect, at least not yet, but it was acknowledgement. She had shaken him, and she would keep shaking him. Judge Harding didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the documents in front of him, staring down at them with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He was trying to maintain his composure, trying to reassert his control over the room, but Elena could see it, the crack in his armor. She could see that he didn't think she had what it took to win, but somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. The numbers, the evidence, they spoke for themselves. Elena stood tall, unwavering, as the room buzzed with an unspoken tension. She wasn't just fighting for the case anymore. She was fighting for the truth itself. And if Judge Harding thought he could silence her, he was in for a much bigger shock. Elena had made her mark. She wasn't going anywhere. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice strong and clear, "I will present further evidence, because the truth doesn't need to be hidden. These numbers, these documents, they don't lie, and neither will I." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. Elena could feel it, the shift, the understanding that was settling in the air. No matter how much they tried to undermine her, no matter how much they tried to laugh her off, the truth would always rise. And Elena Ramirez was the one to ensure it did. The courtroom had been silent for what felt like an eternity, but the tension in the air had risen to a boiling point. Elena stood there, her breath steady but her heart racing. She knew this moment would change everything. The entire dynamic of the courtroom was about to shift when she played that recording. It was her moment to expose the truth, and she couldn't afford to miss it. The lights above seemed to illuminate everything more sharply, casting a stark light across the room. Elena stepped forward with purpose, each step echoing in the dead silence. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her, and she could feel the weight of their gaze. This was it, the opportunity she had been working towards for so long. She had prepared for this moment, but as she reached into her bag, there was no hesitation in her actions. Her hand was steady as she retrieved the small recording device from her pocket. The stillness in the room was so intense that even the faintest sound of the recorder clicking into play seemed amplified, filling the room with an electric tension. The instant she hit play, Davy's voice rang out, clear, sharp, and dripping with arrogance. "I know you can do it. Just sign this, and we won't have any trouble. Don't worry, I'll help you keep your position." Elena felt the air in the courtroom constrict as Davy's words reverberated throughout the room. These were the words she had uncovered during her secret investigation, now brought to light for all to hear. With every syllable, the truth that had been buried for so long began to surface, unraveling the web of lies that had protected him. As the recording continued, Elena's grip on the microphone tightened, but her composure remained firm. She could see the room shifting. People were beginning to realize the magnitude of what they had just heard. Her eyes remained fixed on the documents in front of her as she let the audio play on. The courtroom had fallen into an almost unnatural stillness. The sound of breaths being held, the rustling of papers, and the faint hum of the air conditioning became almost too loud in comparison to the tense silence that had descended upon the room. Then, just as the words had begun to settle, another voice cut through the air, Harding's voice. His tone was calm, confident, and completely devoid of any remorse. "I don't care about what happens after I sign. If it keeps me in this judge's seat, I'll do whatever it takes to protect my power. Those beneath me will never dare to oppose me." The words hung in the air like a weighty silence. Elena could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a quiet murmur of disbelief in the room now escalated into a full-blown storm of realization. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was evidence, a damning, undeniable link between Harding and Davies, revealing a deep, dark conspiracy to manipulate the system to protect corrupt interests. The room seemed to tear open as the implications of the audio hit everyone at once. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, the shock visible on the faces of the courtroom's occupants. The attorneys, the staff, and the public gallery were all stunned, each person grappling with the weight of what they had just heard. The very man who was supposed to uphold justice was now revealed as a co-conspirator, actively working to conceal crimes that harm the public and, worse, working to keep his seat of power no matter the cost. Elena didn't need to say anything more. She simply stood there, unyielding, her eyes fixed on Judge Harding, waiting. The words on the recording had already done their work. They had stripped away the veneer of respectability that Harding had long hidden behind. Now there was nothing left to hide. The truth was out. For a long moment, Harding sat frozen, his hands gripping the edges of the table with white-knuckled intensity. His eyes widened, staring at the screen, at himself, at his own voice in the recording, unable to justify the damning evidence that had just been laid bare. The room was silent, the stillness hanging like a thick fog. As Elena stood there, she noticed the way the crowd's eyes shifted. Those who had once held reverence for the man behind the bench were now looking at him with anger, disgust, and betrayal. The fear of him, the power he once commanded in this room, had crumbled away, replaced by a growing sense of outrage. But Harding wasn't ready to give up just yet. Rather than show any remorse, any sign of guilt, he gritted his teeth and shot a venomous glare at Elena. His face reddened with barely contained rage. The courtroom seemed to freeze in place, the tension so thick that it was almost palpable. Elena stood firmly, unwavering, while the rest of the room seemed to hold its breath. The moment the recording ended, it felt as though the very air had been torn apart, leaving an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on everyone present. Some still couldn't believe what they had just heard, but Elena's eyes never wavered from Judge Harding, the powerful figure, the man who was supposed to represent justice, but whom she now saw clearly for what he truly was. Harding sat up straight, his eyes wide with fury, his lips tightly pressed together. The challenge in his eyes had shifted. It was no longer just the usual arrogance. Now there was a flicker of anxiety, a tinge of fear he couldn't entirely hide. In the span of just a few seconds, however, he regained his composure, masking his emotions with the cold professionalism he had always relied upon. He turned toward the rest of the courtroom, nodding slightly as if signaling that everything should continue as normal, as though nothing had happened. "This is a fraud," Harding spat, his voice sharp, cutting through the air with venom. He shot a glare at Elena, his disdain unmistakable. "You think you can defeat me with a fake recording?" His voice was like a heavy blow, forceful and commanding. But Elena remained unshaken. She stood her ground, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering, never once diverting her attention from him. She knew that Harding wouldn't accept the truth easily. His power had been built over years, and he wasn't about to let a single piece of evidence disrupt his carefully crafted empire. But she also knew this was her moment, the only opportunity to push back against the lies. "Your Honor," Elena's voice was calm, unwavering, cutting through his accusations with a quiet strength. "This recording is genuine, irrefutable. It was legally obtained and verified by the relevant authorities. If Judge Harding wants to deny the truth, I am prepared to present further evidence." The air around them seemed to grow even heavier, like a storm that was about to break. Harding, now visibly angry, shot a look at the court, his voice becoming shrill with barely contained rage. "Do you really think I'm going to let you tear me down this easily?" he snarled, suddenly standing, slamming his fist onto the table. The sound rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. "Do you even know who you're facing? You have no idea the power I hold." All eyes in the room turned toward Harding, but he didn't seem to care. His anger was all-consuming, and he unleashed a torrent of accusations, his voice growing more frantic, more desperate with each word. "This recording is fake. Everything you've done is just an attempt to destroy me, destroy a judge who represents justice. You're nothing but a rookie with no experience, no understanding of what it means to stand against me." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. She stood tall, calm, as steady as a mountain, while Harding's outburst filled the room. The contrast between them could not have been more striking. Where he was furious and frantic, she was composed and unyielding. She understood. She knew that this wasn't just a battle of evidence. It was a battle for her right to stand here, for her right to exist in a system that had never been made for people like her. She had fought too hard to let someone like Harding, someone who had spent his life twisting the law, distract her from the truth. His words only fueled her resolve. Elena looked at him with a steely determination that could not be shaken. The truth had already been spoken, and no amount of anger or deflection from Harding could change that. She wasn't going anywhere. "You can try to deny it all you want," Elena said, her voice cool, cutting through his outburst with surgical precision. "But the truth will remain. These documents cannot be erased simply by a lie, and I won't let you get away with this." Harding, trying to maintain his composure, quickly returned to his desk. He picked up a pen, his fingers trembling slightly, but he began to scribble notes as if trying to regain control over the situation. Elena, however, took a step forward, a small, deliberate movement, but one that conveyed everything she needed to say. "If you wish to continue denying the truth, I have more evidence to present," she said, her words like daggers in the silence that followed. Each syllable was a weapon, striking at the heart of every lie he had tried to conceal. Harding paused. His hand trembled ever so slightly as he gripped the pen tighter. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed across his face. He couldn't stop the truth. No matter how hard he tried to cling to his power, it was slipping away from him. Elena had made her stand. She had opened the door to the truth, and there was no way he could close it again. The courtroom was heavy with silence, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. Every eye was on Elena, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But she didn't let it break her focus. She had prepared for this, the final moment when everything would come to light. The truth that had been hidden for so long was about to be exposed, and no one could deny it any longer. The tension was palpable. The people in the room could feel it too. A few of the audience members had already straightened in their seats, as if they knew that this was the moment that would shift everything. Judge Harding, despite trying to maintain his composure, could not mask the flicker of unease in his eyes. The calm facade he had worked so hard to maintain was slowly cracking. There was a storm brewing inside him, and it was clear he knew that his fortress of power was beginning to crumble. Elena, however, remained unfazed. She didn't flinch or falter as she slowly opened the file before her. She took out a few carefully concealed documents that had remained hidden up until now, documents that held the final piece of evidence she needed, Judge Harding's signature. Her eyes locked on Harding without hesitation, her voice cutting through the tense silence with unwavering resolve. "Your Honor, these documents prove that Judge Harding signed off on the paperwork that allowed Davies to carry out these illegal transactions." Her words landed like a thunderclap, shattering the facade of control that had long been upheld in this courtroom. The room went dead silent, and Elena could feel the weight of every gaze, all eyes on the documents she held. The atmosphere became suffocating, the truth so undeniable that it filled the air with a stifling pressure. She slowly raised the papers, ensuring that every single person in the room could see the signature, Harding's unmistakable signature, clear and bold on the pages. "This is your signature," Elena continued, her voice steady, piercing the silence with precision. "And you signed off on these illegal transactions, enabling Davies to embezzle millions from public funds. You tried to cover this up, but the truth is now here." The courtroom seemed to freeze in place. Judge Harding, who had once ruled with unwavering authority, was now reduced to a man who could no longer hide behind his power. His face, once confident and composed, had turned pale. A sheen of sweat began to appear on his forehead, and though he tried to force a smile, it came off more as an involuntary grimace, a pathetic attempt to maintain control, a mask that was no longer enough to conceal the truth. This is a misunderstanding," Harding stammered, his voice trembling as he tried desperately to regain his composure. "Surely this is just some error, a mistake in processing the paperwork." Elena didn't give him an inch. She stood firm, unyielding. She had been preparing for this moment for far too long to let it slip away now. There was no room for excuses, not anymore. "You think I'll accept your denial, Your Honor?" Elena countered, her voice unshaken, her words sharp and unrelenting. "These documents were legally obtained, and those signatures are yours. They cannot be erased simply because you choose to deny them." The room remained still. No one dared to speak. The tension was unbearable, but in that moment, Elena knew that the truth had already changed everything. Even if there were those who still doubted, those who wanted to turn away from the harsh reality, the truth had already been set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. Judge Harding, now visibly shaken, could no longer maintain the facade of indifference. His hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, and he stared at the documents before him as if hoping they would disappear. He couldn't bring himself to look at Elena. His entire world, his power, his reputation, was crumbling before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elena didn't stop. She knew this battle wasn't over yet, but she also knew that the war was shifting in her favor. The truth had been laid bare, and no amount of denial or anger from Harding could erase it. "None of you in this room can deny the truth now," Elena said, her voice cold and resolute. "And you, Judge Harding, can no longer turn a blind eye to justice." The silence in the courtroom was thick, oppressive, as if time itself had stopped. But Elena, standing firm before the judge, knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. This was no longer just about a trial. It was about something much greater. It was about justice, about exposing the corruption that had infected the system for so long, and about making sure that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond accountability. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, not out of fear, but out of the strength that came from knowing she had the truth on her side. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elena felt the scales of justice tipping in her favor. The courtroom felt like a ticking time bomb, every moment building toward an inevitable explosion. Every eye was on Elena and Harding, two figures at the center of a battle that had turned into something far more than a legal case. The recording, the irrefutable evidence, and now the ultimate confrontation between justice and power. What Harding had so long concealed was about to be exposed for all to see. Elena took a deliberate step forward, her hands clutching the documents she had so carefully prepared. Her heart was steady, her resolve unshakable. She couldn't afford to step back now. Harding's challenge was merely another obstacle she had to overcome. This was no longer just a case. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for the integrity of the system that had long been tainted by power. "Do you really think you can hide the truth forever, Judge Harding?" Elena's voice was unwavering, full of determination. "It's time for you to face what you've done." The room fell completely silent. The tension in the air became suffocating. It was as if the entire world had paused, all eyes fixed on Elena and Harding, the man who had once held so much power in this room, the man who had decided the fate of so many, now stood before her, about to face the consequences of his actions. Harding didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Elena with eyes full of hatred. The confidence and arrogance that had always marked his presence were now completely absent. His posture, once upright and proud, now seemed slightly hunched, the facade of invulnerability starting to crack. He could no longer hide the fear creeping into his expression. "You won't win," Harding hissed, his voice hoarse with suppressed anger. "You don't have the power to take me down. I'm a judge, and I won't let you destroy everything I've built." But Elena, standing like a rock in the storm, didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, her voice as cold and firm as steel. "The truth can't be hidden forever," she said, her words cutting through his venomous outburst. "You can sit on that bench for the rest of your life, but justice will never be extinguished." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Just as the intensity of the moment seemed unbearable, the door to the courtroom suddenly swung open. Two FBI agents, dressed in their formal uniforms, entered with a deliberate, authoritative stride. The room turned to them, their entrance a jarring interruption to the tension that had been building for so long. No one could have anticipated what was about to unfold. "Judge Howard Harding," one of the FBI agents declared, his voice clear and commanding. "By the order of the FBI, you are under arrest for corruption, embezzlement, and abuse of power." The reaction in the courtroom was instant. A collective gasp reverberated throughout the room. A few people in the public gallery closed their eyes in disbelief. Others exchanged shocked glances. The truth, once so carefully hidden, was now out in the open, and the power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Harding stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He turned to look at the FBI agents, his eyes wide with panic. His mouth opened, but the words came out stammered, unsteady. "What? You can't do this. You can't arrest me. I'm a judge. I can't be treated like a criminal." The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The weight of his words seemed to reverberate against the walls, but it was clear the moment had passed. Elena had brought the truth to light, and now it was unstoppable. Without hesitation, the FBI agents moved forward, and in a swift motion, they shackled Harding's wrists. The cold click of the handcuffs echoed through the room. It was as though the very power Harding had once wielded had now turned against him, tightening around his wrist with a cruel finality. "You won't escape." Elena's voice cut through the thick silence. She didn't flinch, didn't show any mercy. You used your power to suppress the truth, but today, justice will be served. The room was completely still. No one dared speak. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the faint shuffle of feet, the clink of handcuffs, and the heartbeat of the truth that had finally been set free. Harding, once the embodiment of power in this courtroom, was now nothing more than a man, a criminal, led out by those he had once commanded. The judges, the lawyers, and the public who had once respected him now looked on with disdain and anger. For the first time in a long while, Elena felt the weight of the room shift. The balance of power had changed. The man who had corrupted the system, who had used his position to further his own agenda, was now facing the consequences of his actions. Judge Harding was no longer a judge. He no longer held any authority. His world, built on lies and power, was now crumbling. And Elena, the one who had dared to expose him, stood victorious, not just in this courtroom, but in the fight for justice that had been long overdue. The fall of Judge Harding was not just the end of one man's reign. It was a victory for every voice that had been silenced, for every person who had been wronged by a system that had been manipulated by those who thought they were untouchable. And in this moment, the truth had triumphed. Elena stood alone at the podium of the Capitol, bathed in the harsh, bright lights that illuminated the chamber. But in that moment, she felt nothing but the weight of the task before her. The room was filled with faces, serious, expectant, waiting. A light breeze seemed to carry with it the cold chill of tension, as though the very air had become thick with the enormity of the moment. Every breath she took felt heavy, but it didn't fill her with fear. Instead, it fueled her resolve. This moment, the culmination of everything she had fought for, was at hand. She could feel it. The final confrontation between truth and corruption was about to unfold. Her gaze swept across the room. The lawmakers, the powerful figures of the nation, many of them who had been complicit in maintaining a broken system, were watching. Elena could sense the weight of their eyes upon her, yet her heart remained calm. This was no ordinary speech. This was the final battle, the battle to demand justice, to call for the reckoning that had been long overdue. Ladies and gentlemen of the Congress, Elena began, her voice reverberating with strength, breaking the silence that had gripped the room. Today I stand before you not only as a prosecutor, but as a fighter for justice, for truth. A truth that millions of Americans have endured for years, yet no one dared to speak of. Her eyes locked onto the faces before her, some of the most powerful people in the country. They remained silent, but their eyes, sharp as daggers, betrayed their unease. Elena wasn't about to be intimidated. She wasn't going to back down, not now, not when everything was at stake. Our judicial system is rotten to its core, Elena continued, her voice growing more powerful with each word. It is no longer a tool for protecting justice, but a mechanism that safeguards the interests of the powerful, a system where judges can abuse their power to aid criminals, and no one dares to stand in their way. Her words were like a hammer, striking the heart of the room. She could feel the shift, the tension mounting, but she didn't stop. This was her fight. This was the moment that could no longer be ignored. I am here today to demand that you, those who hold power, do what is right, Elena said, her voice resolute, unwavering. Reform the justice system now. Do not allow a judge to continue selling justice to the highest bidder. Do not let power continue to overshadow the law. Her words were not just a call to action for the room. They were a cry to the nation, to those who had been silenced, marginalized, oppressed by a system that had failed them. She spoke for the poor, the forgotten, those whose voices had never been heard because the system was built to silence them. We cannot allow people like Judge Harding to exist in this system any longer, Elena continued, her voice now rising with the intensity of her words. They are the embodiment of decay, the lie that has taken root in our public institutions. Justice cannot be bought, and we cannot allow a judiciary that one can exploit for personal gain to persist. Each sentence from Elena felt like a direct hit, tearing through the defenses of the system's protectors. She could see it, the discomfort, the realization from the faces in the room, even as they tried to hide it. The truth was starting to settle in, to pierce through the illusion of order they had long upheld. We need a system where everyone can stand before justice without fear, she declared. The justice system must be a tool for the people, not for the wealthy and the powerful. It must be a system where the weak and vulnerable are not trampled under the feet of those who have power. Elena turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room. She saw the resistance, the unwillingness to accept what she was saying, but she wasn't backing down. She would not be intimidated. Today I stand here not only for myself, but for all those who have been pushed down by the system, she said, her voice firm. unyielding. For those who have been marginalized, forgotten, oppressed, and silenced in this society. The room was completely still. It felt as though time itself had paused. No one spoke. Elena's words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a call to arms. She could feel the weight of history in this moment. The system had been exposed, and though the change wouldn't happen overnight, she knew it was starting now. We need change, Elena continued, her words building in intensity. And that change will not come from empty promises or from politicians who only seek to protect their own interests. It will come from those who are willing to stand up and fight for justice, for the voiceless, for the forgotten. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, letting the power of her message settle over everyone in the room. Then, with a final surge of determination, she concluded, "Let us create a justice system we can be proud of, a system in which everyone is protected, where justice is blind to wealth, race, and gender." The lights above her shone brighter, but Elena felt like she was glowing from within, not because of the spotlight, but because of the truth she had just delivered. Her words had the power to ignite change, and though it might take time, Elena knew the change was coming. It was inevitable now. The room was thick with silence, a silence so deep it seemed to weigh heavily on everyone present. The only sound that could be heard was the soft intake of breath, a collective anticipation hanging in the air. The spotlight shone brightly on Elena as she stood before the nation's most powerful lawmakers. Yet, despite the intensity of the moment, she felt no fear, only the strength of conviction burning within her. This was no longer just a speech. This was a turning point, a declaration that would reshape everything. Elena knew that the battle was no longer hers alone. The words she spoke, the evidence she had unveiled, had transcended her personal fight. What began as an individual resistance had now become a resounding call for systemic change. The courtroom, once a place of fear and silence, had transformed into the stage for justice unfolding before an audience that could no longer turn a blind eye to the truth. Suddenly, a lone clap echoed from the back of the room. At first, it was barely audible, but it soon grew louder, more forceful, as others joined in. It was as if the dam had finally broken. One by one, members of Congress stood up, their applause growing stronger, a wave of support that spread throughout the room. The people who had witnessed everything, who had been part of this moment from the beginning, now stood united with Elena, not because they expected anything in return, but because they recognized the truth she had laid bare. The audience, once silent observers, had now become active participants in this moment of transformation. They clapped not just for Elena, but for the truth she had revealed. It was a sacred moment, one where years of oppression, of being silenced, had exploded into powerful waves of support. The collective recognition of the truth was louder than any words could express. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice steady, though there was an unmistakable tremor of emotion underneath. "This is not just my victory. It is the victory of all those who have been ignored by the system. This is the victory of justice." Her words were not just a personal declaration, they were a reminder that she was no longer alone. She had fought against a corrupt system, and now there were others standing with her, united in the fight for a fairer, more just society. The energy in the room shifted. It felt as if the wall that had kept justice separate from power had finally come crashing down. This was not just a legal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been oppressed by a broken system. It was a victory of spirit, of faith and justice, something that many had long since lost. Some of the representatives who had been quietly observing up until now stood up. They were no longer afraid. The truth Elena had brought to light had made them realize that they had a duty not just to the people in the room, but to all citizens. The applause grew louder, a chorus of empathy, awakening, and hope. Justice can never be something that only the powerful can purchase. One of the representatives called out, their voice carrying a weight that made the room even more intense, but also filled with a renewed sense of belief. Outside the room, the people watching on television, the citizens who weren't present but had been following this moment, felt a shift. For the first time, they saw a glimmer of hope, a promise that they were no longer alone. The support from the crowd was not just for Elena. It was a collective recognition of all those who had refused to bow down, all those who had continued to pursue the truth despite the obstacles, the opposition, and the injustices they faced. The applause didn't stop. It echoed through the room, resonating with the hope and change that had just begun to take root. Elena, despite standing in the midst of the storm of applause, remained unaffected by the noise around her. Her eyes were fixed forward, her gaze illuminated by the light of the change she had helped bring into being. The truth, no matter how long it had been concealed, was now exposed for all to see. And once the truth was revealed, no one, not a single person, could deny it. The scene unfolded beneath the brilliant evening sky as the sun began to sink behind towering skyscrapers. Yet, in that space, a flame of hope burned brightly, unyielding. Elena Ramirez stood on the podium, gazing down at the sea of young faces gathered in the park in front of the Capitol. The energy radiating from the crowd was palpable, youthful, eager, their eyes alight with belief and a thirst for change. This was not just a crowd. This was the embodiment of a new generation, one that would no longer accept silence in the face of injustice, one that was ready to rise and fight for justice and equality. Elena saw it in their eyes, a burning desire for change, a fire that was igniting within each of them. She felt that this was the beginning of something much greater, a movement that would not be confined to just one case or one victory, but a societal awakening. You are the ones who will bring about the change. Elena's voice rang out, strong and clear, filled with emotion. Today, we have reclaimed justice, but you are the ones who will carry it forward. You will be the ones who will never let injustice be repeated. She stood there, her hand raised, pointing toward the faces of the young people listening intently. Hope radiated from her heart, knowing that the victory wasn't about self-congratulation, but about realizing that the fight was far from over. A new generation had been awakened, and they would be the ones to carry the torch of justice for all, especially for those who had no voice. In that moment, Elena didn't just see the faces of young people. She saw a brighter, fairer future, a future where these young warriors would continue the fight she had begun, standing for the values she had fought for all these years. The applause began to swell from the crowd, but Elena didn't allow the clapping to distract her. She stood tall, her eyes locked onto the faces that were focused on her. Then she gently spoke. Justice is not a gift handed to you. Justice is something we must fight to protect every day. It is never guaranteed, and if we don't protect it, it will be stolen. A deep sense of fulfillment washed over Elena. She had won this case, but it was so much more than that. She had sparked a wave of change, igniting a movement to fight against injustice and racism. What she had done today wouldn't just impact her generation, but it would ripple out to influence those who came after. The young people here would be the ones to carry on this fight. This is not the end. It is the beginning, she declared. We must not only fight for ourselves, but for those who cannot speak for themselves. We must ensure that justice and equality are the rights of every person, regardless of race, gender, or social status. Her words were a powerful commitment, not just to herself, but to all those who had supported her throughout this long journey. The justice she had achieved wasn't just a personal triumph. It was the victory of a movement, of an ideal she had always believed in, that every person deserves to live in a fair society. The crowd began to roar, the applause growing louder, more fervent, and Elena could feel the warmth of love and support from everyone present. She no longer felt alone, for now, she knew this fight would not end when she walked away from this podium. A wave of change had begun, and these young people would be the next warriors in the never-ending battle for justice. Thank you for standing with me, Elena said, bowing her head slightly, a sincere gesture of gratitude. Together, we will build a society where justice is not just an ideal, but a reality that we can all enjoy. She turned to walk away, not needing to look back, because she knew the change she had started would never stop. Justice had been reclaimed, and it would never be stolen again.